In 2011, Kelly Williams Bolar, an African-American single mother from Akron, Ohio, was sentenced to 5 years in jail for using her father's home address to get her kids into a better school district. That sentence was ultimately suspended to just 10 days in jail and 3 years probation. Many argue that Bolar is not that different from actress Felicity Huffman, who was sentenced this week for paying to inflate her daughter's SAT scores. Both did what they did to get a better education for their children. That is the argument we've heard. But there's one difference: the punishment. Huffman was sentenced to just 14 days for her role in the college admissions scandal. 2 weeks. Here to discuss, Midwin Charles, attorney at the law firm Midwin Charles & Associates, and Darrell West, vice president and director of governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Midwin, what was your immediate reaction to this?
Well, my immediate reaction was, of course, it didn't surprise me because she's a wealthy woman. She's a woman of privilege. And as an attorney who has practiced here in New York for 20 years in both state and federal court, it is not uncommon to see a disparity with respect to how litigants are treated when they are rich and wealthy versus poor and persons of color. It's something that I come across all the time. And I think what a lot of people find difficult with this case to kind of understand is the concept of accountability. You see accountability being judged and sort of handed out a lot harsher to the black woman that you mentioned earlier, and not the same against Felicity Huffman. And so the argument is, should Felicity have gotten more jail, or should the other woman have been sentenced to less jail, right?
Well, what we get
like, how
out
do
of
we
it
deal?
Is at least a conversation.
Right.
It's raising a red flag to talk about it, because we weren't talking about this woman in Akron, Ohio back in 2011. Darrell, what was your reaction?
I agree. I think it's completely unfair. Felicity Huffman should have gotten much more jail time because she was cheating to try and get her daughter into a better university. And I used to teach at Brown University. I saw favorable treatment for children of the rich and famous all the time. These elite universities now have an acceptance rate between 5 and 10%, and it's basically become an arms race to try and get into these universities. And so I can see parents like this engaging in this behavior, but universities have some culpability as well. They need to have a fairer environment. They need to be more equitable in the way that they treat various students.
But should the answer be level up, give Felicity Huffman more time, or should both of these women be looking at less? These are nonviolent crimes, and we've got a whole lot of people in jail in this country, and that's expensive.
That's exactly right. I think it's the latter. I think what we ought to be doing as a country is talking more about accountability and what that looks like. Does it make sense to take a mother away from her child and put her in jail when she has committed a nonviolent offense? Are there other ways that we can look at remedying this situation? But one of the things that we have to also talk about is sentencing. How are judges sentencing the people that they see before them when they come before them? And one of the things that I always notice is that when you have a white person or a person of privilege who's about to be sentenced, there is always an additional level of grace, an additional level of understanding the circumstances under which this person committed the crime. And you don't see that same level of grace being given when the litigant is a person of color or a person who is poor. We saw it with Brock Turner, right? Remember when he was accused of raping that woman, and the judge said, oh, he has his whole life ahead of him.
His father said he wasn't even getting to eat his favorite dinner.
Yeah, well, we can't put him in jail. And that might be, and that's fine. I think that's a reasonable argument to make for a human being. But is that argument being made when the perpetrator is a person of color or when the perpetrator is poor? And that's really the discussion we ought to be having in America with respect to sentencing. And the numbers are there with respect to how black people are sentenced versus white people. It's a no-brainer now. I mean, these are now facts with respect to the disparity, and it's glaring, and we ought to do better.
I want to talk about a different story of privilege. I know this one matters to you. We're learning more and more about MIT and the Media Lab's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig, he came out recently defending the head of the Media Lab who took money from Epstein knowing he was a convicted sex offender and hid it, covered it up. People who are part of that Media Lab called Epstein Voldemort. This wasn't a mistake. They knew about it. But Lessig is arguing that the reality today is that universities need to take money from questionable sources because they're using the money for good. What do you think of that argument?
I was completely shocked at his argument because in other parts of his life, he always has called for greater transparency in American politics and campaign finance reform and so on. And I think there's a distinction between Harvard and MIT in the sense that MIT took money after the conviction a decade ago. Harvard had taken money before it. After the conviction, they basically refused to accept any more money. So what MIT did was actually much worse. And the fact that they tried to hide that contribution makes the offense even greater.
Medwin, what's your take here? When we hear people like Bill Gates, who have their own massive, well-staffed foundation, giving money to the Media Lab and directing it through Epstein, the same thing from Leon Black, co-founder of Apollo, many of us simply asking the question, why? What's your take on this?
I just don't understand why it is that it has to be, we must take this money from this particular individual. There are a lot of other ways that they can raise money. There are a lot of other ways that they can sort of bring the money in. It isn't necessary to take it from a convicted person who is a registered sex offender. I just think that, you know, again, in talking with respect to privilege and access to money, there seems to be something that we are now sort of uncovering in America and sort of peeling the veneer off of, is how are wealthy people operating, right? And I think most of America now is sort of getting that front seat, like, wow, they really do get over on a lot of ways. And I just don't think with respect to the Media Lab, it was necessary for them to take this money. So this argument that this man makes that, well, you know, what's the big deal, is sort of indicative of what we see happening in this country, which is lacks of standards, right? No one has integrity anymore. Who cares? Throw it out the window. It doesn't matter. And we need to kind of get back to standards, integrity, character, morality, and all those things in this country.
But is it that the rules of the game have gotten so warped? Daryl, you know that fundraising has become a blood sport. You mentioned Brown University. If you look at Brown's board of directors, it's a who's who of New York's richest and most famous people in the world of high finance. So is the real problem not necessarily the individual, but that the pressures have gotten so great to raise massive amounts of money, and these people are saying, I went into a world of academics not to be a fundraising machine, and that's what many people have turned into.
I mean, it shows the problem. The problem is that wealth has corrupted every part of American society, government, business, and academia. It's not a new story, but the pressures seem to be becoming more intense. I mean, what MIT did, not just on this front, but in other areas, I believe crossed the line. And so I think people just have to understand the way that wealth is having all these negative consequences. The good news, though, is that there is a public backlash against wealth in terms of public policy in general. People now support raising taxes on the wealthy. Even Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax is polling pretty well. So people see the negative ramifications of great wealth. They're starting to push back and demand more equitable policies.
How does this get reversed? Or does it? People want to be wealthy in this country.
Yeah.
They want to be in a position to join that board, get that opportunity for their kids.
Yeah, I think the way people need to focus, I think what people are most concerned about is fairness. And I think that that's the link that I see between these two stories. And that, I think, is how it gets fixed, is you focus on the concept of fairness. What is fair? And I think for some reason, all of a sudden, people have sort of gotten clueless about that. I'm not quite sure what's fair. Yes, you are. It's pretty simple. I mean, yes, you are. It's pretty simple and it's pretty basic.
You know what's fair when your kid is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and you're talking to them about how they should conduct themselves and what's fair. You know what fair is when you're raising your kids.
Of course. Of course. This idea like, oh, I'm not sure I understand. Of course you do.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.